Hi everyone, this is Kate Barford in Melbourne, Australia, and this is my yearly update on my 19-year-old Arabian gelding Danny boy. In this video, I start with some lunging work and then move on to work in hand and ridden work. In all of the work, my goal is to get Danny to relax and release any tension and muscles he has learned to use incorrectly over his life, such as the underside of his neck, which becomes activated when he incorrectly pulls himself along with his shoulders. Once he releases these muscles, I can then encourage him to engage the proper set of muscles, such as his core, which will stabilize his posture and act as a shock absorption system for his joints. I also encourage him to engage his top line, which he needs to develop in order for him to become strong enough to carry a rider. When I first purchased Danny, he was very unsound. He was very lame on his front right leg and mildly to moderately lame on all his other legs. In addition to issues with hoof trimming, this was largely a result of a lot of concussion going up his front legs as he hit the ground because his front end was doing all the work and he was not engaging his core to absorb the shock from impact. He also has large bone spurs under his front knees, which developed because of this. His back was beginning to drop, and one body worker was concerned that he might have been on his way to developing kissing spine. At the time, I had been studying natural horsemanship, and I had learned a lot about how to control my timing and feel with horses, and I had developed a strong connection with Danny, but I was considering retiring him because he was so unsound. I thought this would be a shame because he was not started until he was 11, and he never really had the opportunity to reach his potential. Most people around me were pretty pessimistic that he could recover, but one good trainer told me that if I changed the way I trained, he would last another 5 years. She started teaching me the basics of rebalancing my own horse, and this piqued my interest to do some research of my own. That is when I found the generous amount of information on classical foundation training that had been shared by Art2Ride, and I began training my horse this way. Because I was coming from the natural horsemanship world, I was doing this training in a rope halter and bareback for a few months, before I met Will at a clinic in March 2018, where he started Danny in the bit. I was skeptical, but I actually found that Danny was much happier with the communication of the bit because it was clearer, and this caused more consistency and less frustration, and I was confident enough in my hands that I wouldn't hurt him. So it's been about 11 months now that he has been trained consistently in the Art2Ride style. I was previously at another agistment where I was mostly working him in a large round yard with a top-of-the-line surface. This was really helpful for me because I could focus on myself and fixing up my seat and my aids without having to worry too much about steering. At first, even in the round yard, where he couldn't see out, he would still lose focus and try to look over the top of it. But after a few months, I had him very consistent in the walk and trot, both on the lunge and in the ridden work. And of course, I was doing lots of work in hand with him out in a big paddock as well. Unfortunately, I didn't get any usable recent video of him in there right before I moved agistments. But you can see me working him in there in a short clip I submitted on my seat and aids, at which point he was starting to gain a bit of consistency in the round yard. And I also got good enough footage to be able to take a few good photos, which I've shared on the Art2Ride fans and followers page. I moved agistments because I was hoping to find an arena to work in, as we had outgrown the round yard. But at this new place, he actually ended up moving much better on grass than he did on the arena surface, which was quite deep and was hard underneath. So I started working him out in this big paddock. Being in a big open space like this changes everything compared to a round yard. And of course, being on grass compared to a top-of-the-line surface also makes a big difference. I basically started over with him when I moved agistments, and I focused on groundwork, getting him comfortable and moving well out here in the work in hand and the lunge work, before focusing too much on the ridden work. He's only been consistently under saddle now for about a month and a half since we moved here. So he had quite a break from the written work, as did I. Working on the grass in this paddock was great in spring, but now that we're coming into very dry summer, the ground is getting really hard. And for a horse that has historically struggled with concussion, this is not ideal at all. If you compare the lunge work in my last video of him lunging 2 months ago, you will find that he was getting a lot more push off the ground in the previous video and was opening up and coming through with his hind end much more. I'm also not working him in the boots that I had on his front legs in the other video because it's just too hot and I don't want to overheat the joints. I'm looking for somewhere else to work him, but for now, the best I can do for him is make sure that he is engaging his core and using his hind end properly so that the shock to his front end is reduced as much as possible. I discussed lunging a lot in my previous video and how you can tell whether a horse is over their back or not on the lunge line. One thing that I'm trying to do differently with my lunging technique compared to the previous video is not follow my horse quite so much. So I am trying to walk on my own circle and stay on that circle and not allow the horse to pull me off of that. I used to follow him a lot because I wanted to keep a soft contact and I didn't want him to hit the end of the line, and also because I wanted him to straighten out and get his front end in line with his hind end. But when you are riding, you will want to be able to direct the horse and keep him on a circle and still get him engaged. You won't want to be following him all around, especially in a big open space like this where you might lose control. So what I have learned is that it is okay for him to hit the end of the line. I just lift the bit a little in his mouth to soften his jaw and poll, and then ask him to step his hind end out so that it comes back in line with his front end, and then the contact becomes soft again. This is the same thing that I would do in work in hand or in ridden work. So I am asking him to align his hind end with his front end, rather than following his front end until it is in line with his hind end. So a lot of what you have seen in this lunge work is me lifting the rein, which is connected to the outside bit ring, and asking him to step under with his hind end. If I am doing it right, I should be timing my whip with his inside hind leg. I may have to ask a couple times with the whip if he does not respond, but I release as soon as he steps the hind out, and then I release the contact when he softens. In the trot, I'd really like to see him opening up more and coming through a bit more with his hind end. I know that he can reach more than this, and I am trying to send him forward more and encourage him to elongate. I also don't want him to drop his hip or lean too much to the inside, so if he does that, then I try to encourage him to take more weight on the outside hind. I'm just observing his balance and trying to see where he is not lined up, because I know that once everything lines up, he will release his back. And once he releases his back and stretches longitudinally, it opens up more space in his vertebra so that he can actually bend a bit on the circle. Okay, so now I'm just going to observe and let you know what I'm doing here. So I'm walking a pretty big circle, but I'm trying to stay on my own circle and keep him out on his own circle. And I'm just asking a little bit with the line for him to soften his jaw and poll, and then I'm using my whip to get him to step his inside hind leg over and out so that his hind end goes out on the circle. So I'm trying to draw his front end onto the circle a little bit and push his hind end out on the circle a little bit. There he's starting to engage a bit nicer, and you can see he's getting some nice hawk movement, and he's starting to step under himself and track up a bit more, but he could still track up even a bit more than that. This walk work is quite nice. You can see he actually was getting a little bit of bend there on the circle as he had released his back and opened up that vertebra so that he can actually bend a little from side to side. He's stepping under nicely with his inside hind, but I'd still like to see him just release his jaw and pull a little bit more. He likes to compensate by pulling himself with his front end, and if I can get him to release those muscles in his front end, then I know that he's really working with the proper set of muscles, which is his core and his top line. And I'm also watching behind the saddle to see if those muscles are engaging. So I'm just asking him for a little bit more walk work here. Asking him for a bit of a leg yield right there. And I will move with him if I'm asking for lateral work. I'll move off of my circle. And there's lots of flies out in Melbourne in summer, so you'll see some irritation from that, but I did put some fly spray on him. Gave me a few nice loose steps there. And so I'm going to go ahead and change directions. So what you see here is me lifting the bit and asking him to step under with his inside hind. So I'm asking him to yield away from the whip and step under with his inside hind. And this is the action that when you find the right spot and you cause them to rotate their pelvis correctly and step under the center of their body, they will lift up their core and engage their top line. And I start close to him so that I can get him responsive to my aids. Because if he's not responsive to them when I'm close to him, he's not going to be responsive to them when I move him out on a bigger circle. So now I'm asking him to yield out onto a larger circle. And you can see he goes straight into a nice stretch. I'm always looking to see whether his top line or his underline is longer. And here his top line looks longer than his underline. I'm still looking for him to soften just that little bit more. I'm looking for that moment where everything just lines up and he can release everything he doesn't need and just move with some efficiency and some flow. So you can see here what I'm talking about him hitting the end of the line. So that's him wanting to pull out off of the circle. So in the past I might have followed him to try and get him to line up. But now I'm just going to try and send his hind end out so that it lines up where it needs to be. And when he softens, I'll release the contact. So there I'm doing a good job of timing my whip with the inside hind. It's interesting to try and find a balance with the size of the circle because on the one hand, you want to be close enough to where you can be effective with your aids, but on the other hand, he can't bend around a very small circle. He actually needs to be on quite a large circle in order to use himself properly. So I'm asking him to yield there because he's lost his back now. There, he's starting to soften a little bit again. Now, one thing that I need to watch is my own posture. Sometimes when I try to get soft, I get a bit slouchy. And also, I want to make sure that I keep turning my body with him. I don't want to get behind. And I don't want to get my feet stuck either. So I just keep asking him to rebalance himself because he wants to carry his hind end on the inside of the circle. So I'm asking him to step his hind end out to the outside of the circle. There he goes. I got a little bit more effective there. I can have a tendency to become a bit passive at times. And my arm's getting up quite high there. I could have shortened the rein, but so when he's not over his back, I have to do a lot of work. My aids have to be bigger, he's less responsive. And I'm doing everything I can to get him to a good place where he's using his body correctly, because the more steps he takes correctly, the more he's going to develop. So I just wasn't getting enough activity in that walk, and I just wasn't getting him to release his energy forward. So I'm going to go ahead and send him into the trot and try and get him more activated. And see if that little touch of extra activity from the trot can help him find release. And the surface is really uneven here. It's also, right now he's traveling uphill, and as he comes around here, he'll be traveling downhill. So it's certainly not as easy for him to balance as it would be on an even surface. And this is definitely his stiffer, more difficult side. So I'm doing the same thing in the trot as I was doing in the walk. I'm sending him forward. I want to see him reaching under himself more. I want to draw that front end onto the circle and push that hind end out on the circle. That's starting to look a little better right there. You can see he actually, everything sort of lined up for just a moment, and he started to float a little more. The rhythm is getting more consistent, and that's one of the main things I'm watching on the lunge line is the rhythm. The 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. You lost it. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. That inside right hind needs to be coming through a little bit more. But overall, there was progress made there, and as I've mentioned, he's not getting as much push and he's not getting as loose on this hard ground as he was back in spring. So I shortened my line there, which is good. I was thinking I needed to do that. And now he's starting to release. And that's looking better. When he releases, it looks like somebody just poured some oil on his joints. It's just moving much more smoothly and continuously. And in a nicer rhythm. So I'm fairly happy with this. I don't need perfection. If I wanted perfection on the lunge line, I would probably need to spend my whole session lunging. But I also want to do work in hand and ride in this session. And this is pretty nice. He's tracking up nicely. He's released the underside of his neck. He's working over his back there. And so I will move on to the work in hand. Now, I used to do work in hand before lunging, but I like to do it just before I ride so that both of us can have the feeling in our minds of the work in hand when we start to ride, because ultimately I want my ridden work to get to a good place as quickly as my work in hand does. He's definitely improved in the work in hand, and I typically only need to spend about 5 minutes on each side to get him to a good place. So just like I did with the lunging, I start by lifting the inside rein and asking him to step over laterally until he fills up the outside rein, at which point I will release and allow him to stretch down into a deep stretch. It's looking nice there. You can see him stretching down into the contact. I make sure that I keep contact with the outside rein so that the size of the circle is maintained by my contact with the outside rein. And when a leg yield is correct, I'm asking him for a little leg yield here, which isn't bad. He stayed in the stretch, and that's controlled by the outside rein. And if I need him to step under a little more with his inside leg, I'll tap with the whip. So he has really fluid and continuous movement here, which is all that I want from him. He's being a little inconsistent with how much he's reaching with the right inside hind, but that's looking better now. Sorry, the left hind. Much better there. So the outside rein is doing most of the work, and the inside rein is just used to block the horse from counterflexing or to ask for a little bit of softening of the jaw and poll with a give and take. Once I get him consistent, I'll try to put him on a smaller circle like I did here to see if he can maintain the same rhythm and suppleness. And he did that quite well. And we'll repeat on the other side. So I'm lifting my inside rein, I'm asking him to step over, I'm tapping him with the whip, and I want his hind, there he goes. His inside hind stepped under there. Still asking him for a little more to yield away from me laterally. Now I'm establishing contact with my outside rein, and I'm just using my inside rein to block him from counterflexing and to ask for just that little bit of softening of the jaw and poll. I'm asking him to step over away from me again. And you'll see here in a moment that some horses are coming through, which gets him a bit distracted. I just keep asking him. So at first with this work, you may need to look back at the inside hind quite a bit. But I can kind of feel with my whip where his hind end is, and I can tell with the rhythm if he is stepping that, how deeply he's stepping that inside hind leg. If it's coming through, he'll be in the right rhythm, and the rhythm will be short if he's stepping short. Okay, so now those horses have passed, and he's relaxed a bit, and he's come into this nice stretch here. You can see he's completely relaxed in the poll. Rhythm's getting nicer there. He's stepping under with his inside hind more there. He's reaching further with his hind legs. We're just watching his hind end and waiting for him to step under a little more consistently and with a bit more fluidity. So right now he's sort of varying between being a bit short and then having really nice steps. And the ground is really chopped up here, so that doesn't help, but this is looking nicer. He's looking a little more fluid here. And on this right side, he can always use a touch more activity. So he got distracted there, but then I was really happy with how quickly he came down from that. And just have him on a slightly smaller circle than I did at the beginning, seeing if he can maintain that stretch. And I was quite happy with that work in hand. Okay, now for the ridden work. As I said previously, we've only been working with some consistency under saddle out in this big paddock for about a month and a half. So we still have a lot of work to do. And unfortunately, taking some time off from the saddle, I also lost my seat a bit. So I have a lot of work to do as well. My main goal with Danny Boy at the moment is that I would like to get him into a deeper stretch sooner in the ridden work. Really get that longitudinal flexion happening where he's opening up his vertebra and where he's engaging his core so that we can make sure that we're reducing the work on his joints as much as possible. So right here you can see that I'm using my leg quite a bit. I'm just trying to get him more forward by using my legs alternately and also using my inside leg to get him to step under with his inside hind. But I'm quite stiff, and I'll talk about this more in a moment, but I need to be using my calf more than my heel to ask him to step over with that inside hind and make sure that I'm in time with it and that my hips are loose enough that I can be in time with it. But as I was saying, my main goal is that I would like to get him into a deeper stretch sooner in the ridden work. You'll see that he gets to a very nice flowing place at the end of this work, which is just absolutely a pleasure to ride. But I want to spend more time where he is really working over his back and less time working to get him there. Watching myself on film has been really helpful because I can see there are a few things that I could do to be more effective and perhaps get him to a better place sooner. With this horse though, it's often just a matter of relaxation, and also he tends to only get to a good place after he has relieved himself once or twice during the ride, which can be frustrating, and you will often see me look back at his tail because when I'm struggling to get him forward, I feel like his body is just a rock, and it is often because he needs to relieve himself, as you'll see later in this video. But I think I need to stop looking back at his tail and just keep sending him forward, using my legs alternately to get him in a really active walk, as that also often helps him to go. And that's just part of working with a live animal. You know, as we say, if you want a perfect consistent ride every time, then you can buy a motorcycle. I really liked this ride because he came out very relaxed. Even though he hasn't fully released his back here, he isn't hollowing it too much and he's tracking up quite nicely, and his hind end actually looks quite fluid. So whilst it takes me quite a while to get that last little bit of his neck out and to get him to really relax his jaw and poll, I don't mind this work too much because he is still using his hind end. But as I said, my main goal is to get him into that deep stretch sooner. There, he released a little bit. Now, I'd like to mention a few things that I could do based on watching this video, if I can coach myself a little bit, what I would do to be more effective and get him to a better place sooner. So the very first thing that needs to be addressed is my seat. I need to think about if my seat is blocking him from releasing in any way? Am I sitting too heavy? Can I stretch my shoulder blades back and lift myself off the saddle a little to help him have space to lift his back? You will also notice that I really need to stretch my right leg and lift my right toe. I actually think that this leg has become much worse since the last time I saw a video of myself ride. As I said, I need to make sure I'm using my calf and not my heel when I use my leg. And my right hip has been very tight recently, and this has affected my whole leg. I used to do yoga really regularly, but I haven't been as consistent recently. Since I saw this video, though, I've been doing yoga every day because I really want to get my nice seat back. And it's much easier if we can fix issues with our own asymmetries when we are out of the saddle. So I definitely recommend yoga for anyone who wants to improve their seat. Also at times, more so in the trot, you might see this. I might arch my back a little bit, which is an old habit that I thought I had fixed. When I used to do a lot of bareback riding, you really have to engage your core, and you can't arch your back or you will fall off. So I haven't ridden bareback in quite some time now because I'm wanting to build up my horse's back, and the saddle helps distribute that weight more evenly for him. But I've lost some of what I had gained in my seat from doing that. So when I arch my back, this reflects that I'm not engaging my core as I should be. Just like when a horse hollows their back, and we fix it by having them engage their core and swing their hind legs under, which tucks their pelvis. I can fix my arched back by tucking my pelvis under and engaging my core. My saddle fit has also felt a little off. I felt that it was low in front, and so I got it refitted. But even since then, it just hasn't felt right to me. And as you can see here, I look like I'm in a bit of a chair seat, and that has a lot to do with me not stretching down into my leg. But I don't think the saddle is helping. But you will see that there is some improvement by the end of the ride in my seat, and dropping my stirrups down a hole might also help. I had put them up a hole for a bit more stability when I started doing trot work with him out here, but he's more stable now, so I could probably drop them a hole. You could see me looking back. I was having to use my legs a lot more than usual, so you can see me looking back to see if he needs to relieve himself, and he is lifting his tail quite a bit here, but when he's ready to go, he will stop and go. So I just need to keep sending him forward. My pelvis is also naturally twisted to the left, and Danny is very sensitive to the seat bones, so I need to make sure that my pelvis is not telling him something different to the rest of my body. Because of this, I find riding to the right more difficult, and it is also Danny's naturally stiffer side. The reason I have been starting my rides to the right is he tends to be more mentally workable on the right side. But now I feel that he's getting more mentally balanced. So I should probably start beginning my work on the left side. Beginning on the easier side usually gets the horse to a good place more quickly and means less time is spent working without the top line engaged. And it usually means the horse is more warmed up by the time that you get to the stiffer side. Aside from my seat, I would really think that I would benefit from focusing more on activity. He is starting to release a little bit here. And he gets lots of praise for relieving himself. So if I focused a little more on activity and sending him forward into the contact, I think it would make the contact a little more stable. I noticed I wasn't using my legs alternately as much as I could have been. And I need to remember that the first thing to do when the horse hollows is to send them forward before I start fiddling with my reins. It's also a sign that I need to focus on more activity, that he really gets much better after trot work. So I need to make sure he is ahead of my leg before I worry about anything else. If he still doesn't get to a good place once I get a bit more activity, another thing I could try is being a little more effective with my aids. Training your own horse is always the hardest because of what I call mommy syndrome, where there's a bit of emotional resistance to becoming firm, which can keep you from being effective and ultimately is not helpful for the horse. So if Danny is not responding to my leg, then I should be tapping with the whip and asking him to step his hind end under. I could also just take a little more contact, asking him to soften the jaw and pull with the inside rein, with a little bit of give and take, and being a bit more consistent with the contact on my outside rein. Sending him forward more might also fix these contact issues though, as I would rather send him forward into a giving contact than take up more contact myself. And I also find that with this horse, less is often more, and it often comes down to relaxation more than anything else. So I really need to do my best to be giving, and I think that's been more challenging in this open area to be giving than it was in a round yard where I know that I can't really lose too much control. A final thing I'd like to mention is that I could use a bit more shoulder fore on the circle to get him engaged. With this horse, he really cannot bend at all until he is over his back. So sometimes just asking him to rebalance himself by bringing his hind end out on the circle can be more effective than asking him to really yield on the circle. I can even start by riding a square and rebalancing him on each side of the square and allowing him to go straight a bit more, as long as his hind end is out on the circle as long as his hind end is out on the square until he is fully over his back before asking him to get into more of a yield on the circle. I can see that I'm leaning to the inside a little bit and I need to stretch up into my outside leg. And not fall to the inside. So whilst he is tracking up nicely, I'm not getting that last little bit from him, and a lot of this might have to do with the stiffness of my own seat blocking him. But he also just needs to release his jaw and pull, and that's where I think I am more effective in the work in hand than I am in the written work. Now, the extra activity in the trot really helps him to engage, but I also tend to become more effective and less passive as a rider in the trot. So here I'm focusing on maintaining contact with my outside rein and stabilizing my seat. I want to engage my core and stay close to the saddle when I rise. And it's a little easier to feel the imbalances in the trot sometimes. So he starts out very hollow in this trot. I'm sending him forward. Softened his jaw and pull there just a little bit with my inside rein. You can see him there starting to soften and think about his balance. Need to get his inside hind out on the circle. So he's doing a bit of shoulder 4 on the circle. And I need to make sure that I'm not leaning to the inside, because it will make him very difficult for him to balance. There you can see he's having a little bit of a lick and chew, and he's finding his balance a bit more, and he's starting to come down into a nice stretch and get over his back. He loses it there, and I'm sending him forward. When I started asking him to trot out in this big open area, it was really difficult. He would just completely take over and run to the gate. And if I tried to put him into a leg yield, he would just run sideways to the gate. I learned to bring my outside shoulder forward because even though we want our outside leg back from the hip to clear the rib cage for the horse to bend, we need to make sure that our outside shoulder comes around to ask the horse to come around on the circle and not to leak out the outside shoulder. I also learned to have a little more contact with my outside leg, as I was riding with it pretty much off the horse entirely, and that was why he was leaving out through that open door. These are things I didn't learn in the round yard where there was a fence keeping him in, so it has been a good experience for me riding him out here. So this relaxed trot that you see here, while it could be more active, is a huge accomplishment for us. I can also tell that he is struggling with the hard ground here, which is also very choppy from us working on it and from cows living out here. So I'm very keen to find somewhere else to work him for summer. I did feel like I was having to push a lot for activity in this trot, and that just when he would start to release, he would want to come down to a walk, and I would have to keep sending him forward. So I'm watching his rhythm here. There it becomes a little bit nicer. There I needed to get his hip out a little bit, and I succeeded in doing that. And his movement's getting a little more flowing. And we're getting a little more activity there. Again, as he comes around that corner, I need to make sure that I'm asking for his hip to come out. And I'm losing a bit of activity there, so I'm sending him forward. But this is a really good start for us with this trot work. I was really pleased with this. And now bringing him back into this walk, you can see there he finally releases that jaw and pull. And you can see him having a lick and chew, and then we'll change directions. Now, typically when we change directions, he goes straight into the stretch because having that activity from the trot helps him. And once he releases, he tends to stay pretty released for the rest of the ride. But that wasn't the case on this day. He felt a bit like a brick when I started him on this side, and the reason was that he needed to relieve himself. And I've got just a couple minutes in here to show you this so that you can see the difference here in a stiff horse not over his back versus a very flowing, very released horse that you will see in just a couple minutes. So I'm doing my best to ask him to soften his jaw and pull with my inside rein while maintaining a steady contact with my outside rein and asking him to just widen the circle. Here I could have a little more contact on my outside rein. But for the most part, I think I'm doing a good job here of asking him to engage his inside hind. And I'm trying to get him to soften. I'm doing a better job of maintaining my outside rein contact there, and he's starting to come down a little bit. And I'm asking for a leg yield here. But he really just feels like a brick underneath me. So now we'll skip to when he actually relieves himself just a couple minutes later. So you can see I'm using my legs alternately a lot to try and get him forward. And he finally relieves himself, and I give him lots of praise because I want him to feel comfortable doing this, as he never truly gets over his back until he does. Now watch the change. It already looks like someone has oiled his joints and his hind legs are starting to reach much deeper, even though he hasn't fully released his back just yet. And now right there, he releases everything. And this is the first moment where he is truly over his back during the ride. And he is truly using the proper muscle groups to protect his joints and develop his top line. Everything up until this moment has been working towards this moment. Up until now, I've been training, and now I can just enjoy the ride. Once he is over his back, I hardly have to use any aids at all. You saw how much I was having to use my legs just to keep him forward before he relieved himself. Now I do not need to do anything to keep him forward because his energy has just released out in front of me, and he is like a ball rolling over the ground. He is so much more responsive to the leg now. And only now can I actually ask for proper lateral work, because he's created more space in his vertebra by stretching longitudinally. So I do ask him for a couple leg yields, and it takes minimal aids to achieve a few really nice steps. But I'll also ask him for some more lateral work after the trot. You can also see here that even though I still need to lift my right toes, my right leg has actually looked longer. And it's easier to sit straight and tall when the horse's back comes up underneath you. Now the trot. So again, I'm trying to establish contact with my outside rein. Sending him forward. We have lots of work to do on our transition to trot, but I know I can get him to a nice place if I just stick with it. And if I think about my own seat and stabilizing my core, that's often what it takes. He's much more active here than he was on the other side, and I'm having to do less to keep him forward, although there could still be a touch more activity. You can see he struggles to find his balance a little bit and his rhythm, especially with the uneven ground here. But once he engages his core, his rhythm gets much more consistent. That's looking a little nicer. Also, when that rhythm gets more consistent and he engages his core, you can see that. Let's wait for him to find it again. You can see his front legs seem not to hit the ground as hard. So his movement's starting to get quite nice and continuous here. And his front end is looking a little softer there. And again, it's just a huge accomplishment for us to be out in this open area and have a nice relaxed trot like that. Now after the trot work, the walk work is even better. I'm asking for more lateral work, and with minimal aids, I get a few really nice leg yields from him. He's just flowing underneath me, and I'm just directing the current subtly with my aids. It's a truly wonderful feeling, and as I said at the beginning of this work, my number one goal with this horse is to spend more time working like this under saddle, and to be more effective at getting to this point sooner. And I'm really looking forward to the feedback from Will and from the associate trainers on how I can achieve this for me and my horse. Watching myself in video has been extremely helpful because it allows me to coach myself, as I do not have anyone on ground watching me, so it is difficult to know sometimes where I'm going wrong. I notice also here at the end of the video that my seat is hugely improved from the beginning of the video. Danny's movement influences my seat a lot, and my seat also influences his movement a lot. And it can take both of us a while to let go of our stiffness and work together. That's a nice leg yield there. And in this direction as well. He gets a few nice steps before I put him back on the circle. And a little shoulder 4 there. And look how far he's reaching under with his inside hind now. And how continuous his movement is. And there's no stiffness anywhere in his body, and that's truly what I want to achieve. Hopefully we will both become more supple as we continue this work and as I get back into my yoga. And we will have more time spent in complete harmony like we are here at the end of the video. Thank you for watching.